cache memory is a really important topic, especially when it comes to performance and organization. In fact, pipelining and multiple execution units and everything we talked about that got us to a superscalar processor, not only would that really not be kind of plausible if we didn't employ cache, but there is some good research out there showing that cache memory might be the single biggest indicator of overall performance that you can invest in. So if you've ever wondered what are the biggest differences between, say, this i7 or i9 processor that costs, multiple hundreds of dollars just for the processor itself versus an i5 or an i3, or an old Core Duo or something that barely costs, tens of dollars, and when in a system that costs hundreds of dollars, one of the biggest factors is cache. Now, there are other factors. The pipelines can be different, and they can have more execution units, they can have more special purpose registers, they can have all kinds of additions, but usually the biggest change, believe it or not, can be cache. So why not just throw an unlimited amount of cache at the problem all the time? Well, cost is always a factor. And we'll talk a lot to why as we go through this. So I hope this, this talk will be not only informative about what cache really is. I'm sure you've probably even heard the term already and have a vague idea that it's some kind of way to kind of get the most important part of memory more accessible to the CPU. But once we've really kind of broken this out and understood fully how multi-cache level cache works, I hope that it also you see why exactly it's such a big performance indicator, and we'll have some cool conversations along the way about differences even between like Apple's A chips like the A12, 11, 13 versus the Android chips like the Snapdragon and the Samsung chips. They're all ARM chips. Where do these performance differences come in? Again, sometimes the biggest answer there, or at least one of the biggest answers, is cache memory. So what is this important thing called cache memory? So cache is a small amount of SRAM. Remember, SRAM is more expensive, but it's faster. It's actually etched in silicon. So remember, this is when we talked about the gated latch. Another way you can do this with a flip-flop, but I like to use gated latch. But it's a way to store a bit, right, a 0 or 1, in a circuit. And that's what SRAM is. DRAM, we said, is what's behind our RAM chips. It's volatile. It's basically capacitors that have a transistor as a gatekeeper. But we basically store a charge in that capacitor, which we have to refresh every so often, which is why it's volatile. And this is slow. It's cheap. It takes up less space. We can store a lot more in the same amount of space on DRAM more cheaply. SRAM, much more expensive, much faster, but it also takes up a lot of space. And because it's etched in silicon, if it's on your CPU, silicon is the most important part of expense-wise of your CPU. Many chip designers will say, many companies who build chips will say, that their profit is found in, a small amount of silicon square. So, maybe a millimeter of silicon square makes a profit or breaks a profit on that chip. Now, if their margins are that tight and you want to add cache, this is a big problem because cache takes up a lot of space. It's very expensive. And I'll actually have some pictures of that as we go. So the strategy here is to affect the memory hierarchy in the best way possible. So we've talked about this, especially in the beginning of the class. Remember, the memory hierarchy is this idea that as we go to the top of the pyramid, our actual registers in the CPU, and then we had cache and RAM and disk. As we go from the bottom part up, things get faster and they get more expensive, right? And they get smaller. But if we correctly build things, we can actually get to a place where, from the CPU standpoint, memory is effectively unlimited. Because if our strategy is good, we can make sure to have the memory closest to the CPU, that's as fast as we can make it, filled with the things the CPU needs. If we manage that, if we manage to keep those things, those little bits of memory closest to the CPU, filled with everything the CPU needed at that moment, memory to the CPU might as well be as large as the largest, fattest part of the triangle, right at the bottom. The moment that there's something missing in that faster memory at the top, called a miss, now we have to go down the triangle, and the slower speed is noticeable. But if we manage to do this in such a way that the CPU never skips a beat, it manages to, like, even if there's a miss, it has something else to do, it has something else to work on, and it never really skips a beat, then we can, for all intents and purposes, treat it as if it has all the memory at its disposal and at the speed we want it to. So cache is a big player in this. Cache is that memory closest to the CPU where we get to store things to basically give the illusion of an infinite amount of fast memory, even though it's an illusion. And the way we maintain that illusion is by clever algorithms and how we maintain what's in cache at any given time. So that's what we're going to dig in here. It's also how we build cache out into levels, because again, there's different expenses as far as how close it is to the CPU. So we can leverage strategies there too. There's even strategies about how we leverage cache when it's shared or not shared between cores. Today, all computers have multiple cores, and you can have cache in each core and cache that's shared among the cores. And believe it or not, there's advantages to both. So we're going to talk about all of that. Now, here is an interesting thing about cache. The CPU doesn't know it exists, right? Even though you're thinking, but wait, you just told me it's like etched in the same silicon as the CPU. Well, yes, but it's insofar as the CPU is requesting a memory address. That memory address, as far as the CPU is concerned, is a place in main memory. Cache sits right in between them. And basically cache has something called the cache controller, which is this little logic circuit that basically, imagine that there's like a way station in the middle of the highway. Like you're driving down the highway and you have an address that you're going to, like in a city, like 5 exits down the road. And all of a sudden there's this way station and you stop and, they look at your address and they're like, oh, well, the thing you were going to retrieve from that address, I already have it. So I'm going to give it to you and I'm going to send you back to where you came from. Or maybe they didn't have it and they send you on your way. Either way, when you left your original place before you got to that way station, you were just given a place to go, right? You didn't know that this way station was going to exist in the middle and it was going to decide if it was going to cut your journey short and send you back early. That was irrelevant. You just had an address at the final destination, right? And that's how you can think about cache memory. It's this thing in the middle. The CPU doesn't even effectively know it's there. Doesn't care. The CPU is just going to ask for things from memory, whether they're instructions or data or things to write. And it's not going to know or care that cache exists. It's just going to go about its business as if it's not there. Okay, so how do we organize cache? So cache is organized into blocks. They're between 8 and 64 bytes, and these are known as a cache line. So the reason why we do it this way is, again, this principle of locality. So the principle of locality of reference basically says that, as we've mentioned before, that if I ask for a particular thing in memory, odds are the things around it are important to me too. So rather than just get one thing from memory, why don't I get a bunch of things from memory? So what are the bunch of things that I'm going to get from memory? Well, remember we talked about the wide path memory access and memory interleaving? Well, I'm going to get the other 8 chips worth of things that are at a similar address, and I'm going to bring them all back. So, if I asked for address 0, I'm going to get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever it is. And they're all going to come back as one cache line. And that's what I'm going to keep in one location and cache. Now, the way we identify these cache lines is with a tag. So basically what the tag is it just identifies the memory location that corresponds to the first item in the cache line. And because we know the size of the cache line, we know what other items would be in that cache line. So, for example, if the cache line has a tag of 0, that means that the first item in that cache line would be what's at memory address 0. If we know that we contain 8 words in our cache line, then that means that we would have address 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 all in the same cache line. So if, for example, the CPU asks for something from memory address 6, and the cache controller looks at its tag and sees that it has tag 0, because the cache controller knows how many things it can store in one line, it knows that memory address 6 does in fact live within that cache line marked by tag 0. So the tag is just an identifier that points to the first location in memory within that cache line. It's a pointer, right? It's a pointer to that location in memory. And using this, the tag, we can now act to determine what storage locations are available to us in cache memory versus which ones do we have to go out to get in main memory. So, for example, a 64 kilobit cache would typically have 8,192 8-byte cache lines within each tag. So what do we call it when we identify that we have the piece of information we were looking for within a tag? That's called a cache hit. So that example I gave before where you wanted memory address 6 and I had tag 0 and I knew I contained 8 things within a tag, that's a cache hit. I have that information, so cache is going to return it directly to the CPU and it's never going to go to memory. However, if you had asked for address 11 and I don't have tag 8 because that would be the first address that would contain the memory address 11, then that's going to be called a cache miss, right? And that's going to be forwarded to main memory so that I can retrieve that information. Now, assuming that there's space in cache that hasn't been used, we're just going to allocate the first line that's empty for that information to come back from memory. Once it's there, we're actually going to return it from there to the CPU. So remember, cache sits in between the CPU and memory, and all requests that would go to memory are returned from cache. It's just whether cache has to go to memory to get the information before it can return it, or if it already has it and then it returns it. A hit ratio is simply the ratio of hits to the total requests. So if we got a hit 95 out of 100 times, we would have a hit ratio of 95%. If we only got 10 hits out of 100, we would have a hit ratio of 10%. That would be very bad, by the way. Normally, hit ratios are much higher than that, and we'll talk to that later. So here's a little bit of a visualization, what we just discussed. So here the CPU is asking for memory address 2334. This is sent to the cache controller, which then evaluates its tags. And in this case, each line stores 4 memory addresses. So we know that we have 2332, which means that we have 2332, 2333, 2334, and 2335 within this cache line. So we can, in fact, return 2334 right from cache. That will go right back to the CPU. So far as the CPU knows, it asked memory for that address and it got it back. In reality, the cache controller said, oh, I got that, short-circuited it, and sent it back directly from its own memory, which is much faster. Now let's look at one where maybe we didn't get what we want. So in this case, we're looking for address 3701. Now initially we have tags here for 1032, 2332, and 0040. Now in this case, ignore the 3700 here. This is where we added in a moment. In this case, this is a cache miss. At the time that we're looking at this, we don't yet have the 3700 tag, so we have to go to memory to get it. Now notice in this case, we also have a full cache. At least in this representation, we only have 3 cache lines to work with. So we have to choose one to replace. Now we're going to talk about the algorithm we use to do that a little later, but for right now, let's just say that we choose one. Maybe it can be at random, but we'll get into the details later. So we replace this 0040. So those 4 pieces come back from memory over the wide path memory address using the memory interleaving to access all 4 at the same time. And then we fill up our cache line with them. We then return 3701 from this place in memory back to the CPU. How do we decide how to replace a line of cache? Before we said, well, let's just pick one at random for now, but that's not going to be good enough. We need a better strategy. The strategy, in fact, has to be solid, because if we pick a bad strategy, like say we picked first in, first out, like a queue mechanism, well, that might work under certain circumstances, but more likely than not, your program is going to have a little bit more dynamic memory needs than just ignoring the oldest stuff and paying attention to the newest. There's probably going to be hotspots, variables that are more commonly accessed, things like that. So why not consider a least recently used algorithm? This algorithm will, in fact, make a decision based upon what was the least recently used line of cache. The one that is the oldest, per se, or at least the oldest in terms of how often or how long ago it was used, will be the one that we actually boot out to replace. This usually works very well. In fact, this basic algorithm in this circumstance usually yields the best results, and it's relatively simple hardware-wise to keep track of. We just need some hardware in the cache that can essentially put an access kind of date stamp on each cache line so that it knows how long ago that cache line was actually used. And then it can just reference that quickly, find the line with the oldest one, and then go ahead and replace it. Now, what if that line had changes? So if there's no changes, right, if that line contains information and it's identical to what's in memory, that's no problem. But as soon as we make a change to cache, now we have a problem, because at some point we got to make sure we actually get it back to memory, because we don't want anything to be inconsistent. We don't want to say update our Word file because we typed a new sentence that's stored in cache, but then it never made it back to memory, and then it got lost and my sentence disappeared. That would be no good, right? But it's more complex than that. A modern computer has multiple CPUs, and while some cache is shared between CPUs, some cache is not. And we're going to talk about that more when we get to multi-level cache in a little bit. So in that case, what if multiple CPUs are actually processing different threads for the same process? And what if one updates a line of cache, which effectively updates a location in memory, but the other doesn't have that same level of cache? It's seen its own version of cache that it pulled from memory, and these two things now are different. We have to rectify that. So there's 2 ways to synchronize anytime you do an update to cache. There's write through, which means we're immediately going to change in memory whatever we need to because we've updated a change in cache. And then there's write back, where it will stay in cache until the line actually gets marked to be replaced. Or it is required by another CPU. Now, we're not going to go into the depths of that, but let's just say that it does require a bit more hardware to maintain this. So write back is faster because we don't have to stop what we're doing. Write through slows us down a little bit because, like I make a change and then it immediately has to kind of pause and it has to make that write to memory, which does give, a little hiccup, a little bubble kind of in the operation of cache. Write back doesn't have to do that. So you can make the change, everything continues on level and without slowdown. But once we then actually mark this thing that it has to be written back, now we have to do that right, which is still more effective, but in a situation with more than one core, this does get very complex because we can't have a situation where we have two different versions of data being viewed by two different CPUs. So managing that is very complex. So while write back is a better solution, its complexity means that it's also a more expensive and harder to implement. What is the performance advantages in general of having cache? Well, generally we would want to see hit rates above 90%, and good news is we usually always do. In fact, AMD and Intel are almost always scoring hit rates above 95%. Now, I say almost always because a lot of this does depend on the workload. This works because of locality of reference, right? We said that if we bring out a piece of information from memory, most likely the other pieces of memory that are near it are also going to be used very soon after. So because of that premise, this works. But if you find a weird workload that the program is just jumping all over the place, then you're going to get a lot more misses. And if you have a small cache, the misses might completely kind of overburden the cache where it's really not getting any hits. If something like that does happen, it's going to lead to a situation where you're not getting the best result. But the good news is that's really, really rare. It's not likely to happen that way. So while 95% or better is very common and in fact usual, a lot of times you'll even see 98% or even more. So that means that 98% of the time, anything you request from the CPU to memory isn't actually going to memory. It's coming back directly from cache. And remember, cache is made out of the same transistors etched in silicon as the CPU's own registers. They might be a little bit more distant, so there might be a few cycles to wait just to kind of traverse the bus, but it is a far cry better than going out to memory. Which means going to DRAM and capacitors, and you're looking at tens of cycles at a minimum, and that's for our highest speed memory today. Let's take a look at what cache actually kind of looks like and how it's evolved over the years. So this is going back quite a bit, but it kind of is a good visualization. This is a 486 motherboard. These were around before Pentiums, and this here is the CPU itself. This here is where you would put the memory modules, which back then were probably 1 megabit a piece on that order, maybe even 512K, and they were very similar, honestly, to RAM modules now, not extremely different. They weren't called DDR, but similar style sockets, not all that different. Notice here that there's these other chips right here in the middle. This was actually the cache on the 486, and not all systems had this. You had to obviously pay for a system that bothered to put it in. This might have accounted for 256 kilobits of cache, and as you can see, it's physically located in between the DRAM modules where they would go and the actual CPU, but it's not actually on the CPU. It's still etched in silicon. These are silicon chips, But it is going to be a little bit slower than a modern cache because it does have to traverse through the main board here to the CPU. Then that kind of evolved to this situation. This is a Pentium Pro. Now, what differentiated the Pentium Pro from the Pentium was the fact that it had this 256 kilobits of cache right here on the die. Now, you might notice that this cache here is basically the same exact size, if not slightly bigger, than the CPU itself. So you can kind of get it. This is a great example to show just how much cost gets added for cache because you've effectively doubled the size of the silicon of the CPU here. And that's just to add the cache, right? The CPU itself is here, and this is the same exact CPU you would have gotten in the Pentium without the Pro level cache, right? So when you look at those more expensive chips and you wonder why they're so much more expensive, this hopefully gives a pretty good illustration of that. I have some more pictures too from some more modern chips as well. This one over here now, this is Pentium 2. So Pentium 2s and Pentium 3s, and I'm not sure if all Pentium 3s were cartridges, but I'm pretty sure they were for a while. They went to this cartridge setup. And why they did that was actually because inside here was kind of this riser board that had the CPU itself with the socket basically hard soldered onto that. But then it gave them an opportunity to offload the cache onto this same board. So it was still very close to the CPU, but it was all contained within this module. And it wasn't on the same exact silicon die. Doing it this way was more efficient from a manufacturing process, and it was cheaper because the larger you made this CPU silicon, the more expensive it was, and if there was any imperfections, the more loss you had because you had to throw away more chips. So it made more sense to manufacture the cache as separate silicon chips. Was it as fast? No, not quite. Was it still fast? Yes. And when combined with the cost savings, it made a lot of sense, especially at the time. So that's what these cartridge modules were actually for. They were actually designed as a way to kind of ship the CPU and the cache, since now cache had become so heavily required to maintain the speeds we were starting to achieve that we couldn't anymore really do without it. It's important to note that in the Pentium times here, the Pentium didn't really have any real cache. The Pentium Pro did. And the Pentium Pro was obviously faster, but the speed of the CPUs was still not that fast that the memory access was still a bottleneck, but it wasn't as bad a bottleneck. As CPUs got faster and faster and faster, memory became more and more and more of a bottleneck. So that's why by the time we get to the Pentium 2, all processors needed some cache if they were going to perform anywhere near what they were billing for. Of course, with more cache, they would do better, but you couldn't really get away from the need for some cache. So that's kind of what led to this unique packaging solution, is they wanted a way to get cache on there without breaking the bank. Something like the Pentium Pro, they could charge a premium price for it because it was the premium high-end CPU. But once they got to the Pentium 2, now you're talking about the kind of more generic one that you're rolling off the line, not, say, a Pro level one. And you need a more efficient way to deal with that packaging. So let's now talk about multi-level cache. Once we get through this, we can use this to kind of illustrate a more modern CPU core and how this all comes together. So if cache is so good, why not break it up into multiple levels? Because just like everything with the memory triangle, we can actually apply that to cache as well and have some levels of cache that are higher on the triangle, that are smaller and closer to the CPU and more expensive, and then other levels of cache below that are bigger and maybe slightly slower, than the higher levels of cache, but still much faster than memory. And keeping that hierarchy going, we might be able to wreak out better hit ratios, because if I don't find something in level 1 cache, now I can go to level 2 cache, and if I don't find it there, maybe I can go to level 3 cache, and you get the idea. I will only go to memory if I don't find it in any of the levels of cache. Now, it is uncommon, but not unheard of, for a CPU to have all of these levels. It usually will have one or two of them. It very commonly may have three of them, and it can have four of them. And it just depends on the design and the cost and everything else involved. But we refer to it as level 1 being the closest cache. If you have any cache, you always have a level 1 cache. So even if it's, going back to here, this was a level 1 cache because it was the only cache. And it was still the closest thing to the CPU because it was closer than memory. But, that's it is what it is. So level 1, if you have any cache, you have a level 1 cache. Now, if you have more than one level, level 1 is the closest cache to the core. It's the closest cache to the CPU. Level 2 is a level of cache now beyond level 1. It's going to be bigger than level 1. It has to be. We're going to talk about that. In a modern CPU, both level 1 and level 2 are usually within a core itself. So this is, again, this is not always the case, especially if you go back, like I even showed you here, right? This was level 1 cache. It's not even remotely close to the CPU. It's all the way over here. This is level 1 cache. It's on the CPU. This is level probably 2 cache. Level 1 cache was actually on the CPU. So in this case, level 2 cache is off the CPU. But in a modern computer, I'm going to show this when we get to like an image of a modern multi-core CPU. Commonly, level 1 and level 2 cache are within a single core, but level 1 cache is like really, really close to the actual ALU and the logic circuits, and level 2 cache might be, kind of like broken off in a separate area. Level 3 cache is commonly cache that is shared between cores. I'm going to show this in an image in a moment. Level 4 cache may also be shared between cores, but it may also be on a chip that's actually shared among many CPUs. So remember, in multiprocessing, you can have a processor with multiple cores, and then you can have multiple processors themselves. So level 4 cache can actually be a level of cache that's shared between processors and all their cores. This is something that you see commonly in something like a mainframe. What they do in a mainframe is they have a book of processors, and that book of processors has a large cache on it that services all of the processors on that book, including all of their cores. And then within each processor, you have another level of cache for all of the cores, and then within each core, they have their own cache as well. Now, this is a lot of cache and is starting to become more complicated, right? We'll get more into what this looks like as far as how we request information up the chain in a moment. Let me show that visualization I was talking about. So here are two CPUs. This one is a quad core. We have 4 cores. This one here actually has 8. Let me do this one first. So here you can see this is core 1, core 2, core 3, core 4. There's some section on here for I/O, and there's the memory controller here. Now let's look at where cache is. You can actually see these smaller circles here. You can see the kind of discoloration. This is actually the level 1 cache. Now, commonly in a modern CPU, level 1 cache is actually divided into 2 separate parts. There's a data and instruction cache, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. And the size of it isn't very big, maybe 32 kilobytes, something like that for each. We'll actually dissect that more in a moment, and why and what its purpose is. Then here is the level 2 cache in each CPU. So that is called upon if the memory requests something from, if the CPU requests something from memory, it first goes to level 1 cache. If it doesn't find it in the small cache, then it's going to send it to a slightly bigger cache. And if that doesn't find it, it's going to send it to the shared level 3 cache. So all of this is a shared cache. Now this can usually be megabytes in size, so maybe it's 1 megabyte or 2 or 8 megabytes on a pretty large size, but who knows, it could get bigger than that. The idea here with this shared cache is if you have a program running, so let's say I have a program and it's using these 2 cores. Well, let's say that it's both cores have 2 threads that are solving the same problem. Maybe they're trying to figure out the genome of a human or something, or a plant, who knows. Core 1 figured out one part and it wants to access another part, so it looks in cache to see if it has it, and it does in fact have it, so it just uses it from this level 2 and bang, it's got it. This one looks and it doesn't have it, right? So it looks at its level 1, it doesn't have it, looks at its level 2, it doesn't have it. So where does it get it from? Does it have to go all the way back to memory? Well, no, in this case it doesn't. And I know that because its level 3 cache must have it because this one's level 2 cache had it. So it's going to come back, it's going to get it from level 3 cache here, which is shared among all the cores, and then it's got it. And the reason why its level 3 cache had it is because it was requested here whenever core 1 needed it at some point prior to when core 2 did. So having this shared cache is a huge advantage because while accessing level 3 cache takes slightly longer than accessing level 1 or 2, it's still much faster than going all the way back to memory. And since this is shared between all the cores, anything that another core has been working on is likely to be there, unless of course the least recently used algorithm has kicked it out for some reason, in which case that might not be. But most of the time you're going to find it there. So that makes a multi-core process a whole lot more efficient, because even though these cores are doing different things at different times, they're likely sharing locality of reference here in this larger shared 3 level cache. Okay, so here is a bigger CPU. This one's just got 8 cores. You can actually see the cache here as well. So here's core 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The level 2 cache is obvious. You can see it right here. See these big gold boxes over here. The level 1 cache is a little less obvious. It's probably this section here. Could actually be this over here. Not too worried about you. You're not going to ask you to identify cache with your eyeballs. I mean, if I asked you to identify level 3 cache, I'm hoping you could, because that's pretty obvious. That's this here. But this here is the giant shared cache in the middle of all the CPUs, right? So this architecture works very well in multi-core CPUs. All right, so what sizes are typical? I've used an i7 here, and this is a little bit out of date, but honestly, this is still pretty current. Level 1 is commonly 32 kilobits, and we'll talk about that multi-level or kind of split personality thing in a moment with the instruction and the data. But it's very, very fast. You can commonly access level 1 cache in 4 cycles. Level 2 cache usually be a lot bigger, so 256 kilobytes, and access to that would take 11 cycles. Level 3 cache, as you saw, could be 8 megabits. Now, this is a pretty good sized one, but again, this is an i7, and this is one of those differences between the higher end processors and the lower end ones. So accessing here, you're still looking at more time, 30 to 40 clock cycles. But when you look at it in kind of contrast to what it costs to access RAM, which maybe is 16 gigabytes, but takes 50 to 200 cycles, this is still much faster than going out here. All right, so let's imagine what the impact would be of these numbers, right? Just to kind of play this out. Let's imagine we have a CPU with a level 1 cache, and this cache has a 1 nanosecond access latency. So if we have a hit in level 1 cache, it's only going to take 1 nanosecond to get the information out. The fact that this takes 1 nanosecond is not really relevant. I'd rather you think more about these kind of times and cycles. I'm using this for a nice even number to make the numbers just simple. So if I have 100 things that I'm getting and it's 1 nanosecond and I get all hits, I'll take 100 nanoseconds to perform all these operations. So now let's imagine that just one thing misses. So we had a 99% hit ratio on level 1 cache. We had one miss. And this is to level 2, not even to RAM. So level 2 now has a 10 nanosecond latency. So it takes 10 times longer to get this thing from level 2 cache, but a lot better than the 50 to 200 that it might take to get it from main memory, right? So this increase is 10% of the total operation, right? So it's now going to take us 10% longer to do these 100 things because one thing missed. And that's just a miss in level 1, not a miss in level 2. So the real benefit of layering these cache levels is this, right? Because if I had to go out to memory, I might have had a 50% increase on this one miss. And that's one miss, not even 2 or 5 or 10, right? So I think you see just how much of an impact cache has looking at these numbers. And this is also a really good reason why we layer it, right? Because in layering it, if level 1 has a 98 or 99% hit ratio, that's okay, we're only losing 10%. And then if level 2 has the same kind of hit ratio, it's only losing that 10%, right? So the more cache, the better. And it's really important to note that the reason why we have these differences in sizes is because if we didn't, cache would just be a copy of the level above it. So remember, the mechanism we use to fill cache, once it's been filled, I should say, like when we have no more empty space, is the least recently used algorithm. So if you imagine that the CPU requests something and level 1 cache doesn't have it, so I have a miss here, and then I go to level 2 and it doesn't have it, so I have a miss here, and I go back to memory, I'm going to retrieve that thing. When I bring it back here to level 2, remember, I'm going to put it in level 2. So to do so, I'm going to first use the least recently used algorithm to decide what line of cache gets replaced. So I'm going to replace that line here. Then I'm going to go back to level 1 with the same information. Level 1 now also uses its least recently used algorithm to decide what its least recently used line of cache is, and it's going to replace it. If these things were the same size, we would have replaced exactly the same line of cache. In fact, they would be a complete mirror of each other. If they were anything other than a complete mirror of each other, it wouldn't be in a line like this, right? Because I wouldn't be running the least recently used algorithm to replace something and then passing it back up the chain. In order for this to work, these sizes have to be different. And in fact, you want them to be different enough that the hit ratios can be maintained. So having these kinds of levels here, where I go from 32 kilobits to 250 kilobits, means that I have enough additional information here, enough extra lines to look at, that I have a good chance of maintaining a good hit ratio that makes this all worth it when going from level 1 to level 2. So you want these things to grow enough to provide a much bigger world, so to speak, of information for the smaller cache to look at, that they have a good chance of providing the information that cache needs. And that's why these things have to grow larger as you get closer to memory. I mentioned that level 1 might be split, and they're commonly actually split into two 32-bit chunks. That there'd be a level 1 instruction cache and a level 1 data cache. Now, this is something that's only ever done in level 1, and it's done for a very specific reason. Remember that instructions are almost always in order. You can, of course, have branches, but most of the time your instructions come in, a very linear manner. And even when you do have a branch, there's a very good chance you're branching to a nearby instruction. So because of that, we're not going to worry much about changing. We don't change instructions. We don't write to them. We just read from them. And we know that they're going to be pretty orderly. So if we have a instruction cache that isn't worried about getting updated by changes, then that is going to be a very, very solid high hit ratio situation. Data, on the other hand, can change. We have to worry about write throughs and write backs, and whether we're going to pause to do the write, and what other CPUs need, and all of that complexity that comes with ensuring that we don't have any problems because we didn't write data back and now another CPU core went to use that piece of memory and it wasn't updated, and it was a mutable piece of memory, something like that. So because of that reason, we want to separate out level 1 cache for the best possible result. So what we do is we have this one half of it that purely gets instructions and another half of it that purely gets data. Now when any updates happen to that data, the part that's dealing with the instructions don't even wince or notice because there's no writes there and everything's usually very orderly, so we have high hit ratios and we're happy. The data side can go about its business, and even though the hit ratios may not be quite as high, they're still very good. And when we have to do a write, we have to do a write, but at least we don't slow down or affect the instruction side at all.